everybody, Dom here. Today I'd like to showcase the various advanced movement techniques possible within the game Left 4 Dead 2. These movement techniques are quite useful to know. Most of them are simple and easy to perform. A lot of them are used by speedrunners for speedrunning the game, but it's still possible to make use of them in normal everyday gameplay. The first movement technique is called quick ladder climbs, and it's used to climb up and down ladders faster than intended. In this game, players are not locked to linearly moving up and down a ladder. Look at this. It's hilarious, but also shows what I'm talking about. Players can move in multiple directions on the ladder, including left and right. When on a ladder, the way the player is facing determines what movement keys do. For example, looking up and pressing forward moves the player up the ladder. Looking down and pressing forward moves the player down. Looking up and pressing backwards moves the player down the ladder. Looking down and pressing backwards moves the player up. If a player is looking towards the ladder and they press strafe left or strafe right, they will move left or right. If a player faces 90 degrees sideways from a ladder, the keys to strafe left and strafe right will instead cause the player to ascend and descend. Here's the interesting part. It's possible to press multiple keys at once and combine the movement from moving forward or backwards, and left or right. Here I am looking down and facing 90 degrees to the left of the ladder. If I press strafe towards the ladder, in this case strafe right, I will ascend. If I press backwards, I will also ascend since I'm looking down. If I press both at the same time, I will move up this ladder faster and successfully perform this movement technique. So, to summarize quick ladder climbs, it's possible to move faster on ladders. It's done by facing sideways and combining the movement of using a strafe key and the backward or forward key. Quick ladder climbs can be performed in 4 orientations: looking down facing left, looking down facing right, looking up facing left, looking up facing right. The one to use comes down to personal preference. To make it easier, on screen are all the key combinations. A few things to note. Looking either straight up or straight down is essential to avoid sliding off of ladders. Quick ladder climbs work the same way when playing as Special Infected and using infected ladders. Lastly, quick ladder climbs can't be performed with a controller. The second movement technique is called idle warps, and it's used to teleport survivors to other survivors. As a survivor in a game with at least one other human-controlled survivor, it's possible to go into the pause menu and click Take a Break, or use the console command Go Away from Keyboard, or bind a key to use this command. When done, this puts the survivor into a state where the bot AI takes control. Off topic, if you ever find yourself distracted while playing Left 4 Dead 2, please use the Take a Break feature. Teammates will appreciate it. It's better to have a bot play the game than to have one person completely idle. Oh my god! Spider my desk! Oh shit! Fuck! Oh no! Oh, God. Back on topic. The AI-controlled survivor can teleport to teammates. If a bot can't navigate to a survivor, after a few seconds of being confused, it will automatically teleport to them, at which point the player can simply click to resume control. It may seem like this technique isn't very impressive, as it's rare that a bot can't navigate to teammates, but on the contrary, it can be pulled off fairly reliably. In most starting safe rooms, it's possible to make a bot get confused and teleport. Simply open the safe room door from the outside so that the door opens inwards. Stand behind the door on the inside of the safe room, and then let the bot take control. Bam! Teleported to a teammate. One thing to note, survivor teammates must be a great distance away for the bot to teleport to them. If any of them are close, the bot might simply teleport to the other side of the door, and continue as normal. Second note, teammates must not be looking in the direction of the bot. They have to look away. Valve didn't want it to be obvious the bots can teleport, so they teleport when out of sight. The third movement technique is called stuck warps, and it's used to teleport survivors to other survivors. Stuck warps are very similar to idle warps in that they achieve the same thing. However, they are executed differently, can be done alone with AI-controlled survivors, and don't have a minimum distance requirement. The game has a built-in failsafe mechanism where if a player gets stuck in geometry, after a few seconds they will automatically teleport to the nearest teammate. If there are no teammates, the survivor instead dies. It's difficult to unintentionally get stuck in Left 4 Dead 2. The most common way to get unintentionally stuck is probably by being pushed into weird geometry. So if a tank punches a survivor or a charger charges into multiple survivors and they get flung. Stuck warps are fairly consistently possible to perform intentionally. They're typically performed in locations with a slope and low vertical clearance. Getting a survivor stuck is done by finding a spot where the ceiling and floor are close to each other and trying to wedge the survivor into a space too small for them to fit, usually while in the standing position, but sometimes while crouching. It's necessary to quickly press and let go of the crouch key to get stuck in certain spots. When it's no longer possible to move, the survivor is successfully stuck. This sounds like obvious advice, but it's actually quite useful when doing this technique for the first time, as there's no feedback on if the technique is working other than not being able to move. A big component of performing stuck warps is the location, so here are some example locations. On the second map of Dead Center, in the starting safe room, a survivor can get stuck by standing on the potted plant and walking up onto the photocopier at the right angle, then pressing and letting go of the crouch key while holding forward. On the first map of Dark Carnival, a survivor can get stuck by walking up the hill underneath the billboard near the car, and quickly pressing and unpressing crouch. On the second map of Death Toll, in the starting safe room, a survivor can get stuck by jumping onto the handrail of the stairs and walking upwards towards the fluorescent light fixture, then briefly pressing crouch while holding forward. The final example location is on the staircase banister on the passing second map. A survivor can get stuck by walking upwards on the banister and quickly pressing and unpressing crouch. Left 4 Dead 2 has quite a few staircases like this that can be used for this technique, places the survivors can wedge themselves under the ceiling. The fourth movement technique is called no ledge grabs, and it's used to stop survivors from grabbing ledges so that it's possible to fall off ledges and skip portions of maps. Under normal circumstances, if a survivor runs off a ledge the developers consider to be a lethal fall, they automatically grab the ledge to avoid falling. In this state, they are effectively incapacitated and need to be rescued by other survivors. It's possible to avoid automatically grabbing ledges. To jump off of a ledge, a survivor must jump and continue holding down the jump key as they fall. To run off a ledge, a survivor must also hold down the jump key. They need to jump, land on the ground while still having the jump key pressed, and then run off the ledge. One useful place to use this movement technique is on the bridge on the third map of Coldstream. The entire sequence of descending from the bridge can be skipped. It's done by jumping onto this green metal area here, standing in the corner, aligning the crosshair with the corner of the boat, and then, while still holding down the jump key, running forward. No! Skipping descending the bridge saves about 10.4 seconds compared to descending the bridge in a perfect scenario where there are no zombies to slow the survivors down. So in real gameplay it probably saves about 25 seconds, let's say. Another useful location to use this technique is at the end of the final map on the parish. It's possible to go over the railing and fall onto the fence below. This saves having to go around, saving about 3.5 seconds. Note, this fall can be done without holding down the jump key as long as the survivor is above 39% health. If they're slowed down due to being injured, they can't run as fast, and so instead they grab the ledge. When low on health, survivors should always hold down jump before running off this ledge to ensure they don't grab the ledge. Another useful location to use this technique is at the end of the Screaming Oaks roller coaster on the third map of Dark Carnival. It's possible to skip having to go around onto the bridge path near the safe room. After exiting the tunnel on the coaster's track, survivors can turn right and jump onto the top of some bushes. When performing this jump, the jump key must be held to avoid grabbing a ledge. From the bushes, the survivor can shimmy along a narrow invisible ledge until they get under the bridge, at which point they can drop down onto the right and head into the safe room. Now that you know how to fall off ledges, here are some movement techniques used to mitigate fall damage. The fifth movement technique is called fall interrupts, and it's used to avoid dying from lethal falls. Left 4 Dead 2 has a mechanic called stumbling. Under certain conditions, survivors can stumble. When stumbling, the player temporarily loses control of their survivor and is forced into third person to watch their survivor lose and regain their balance. Many things can cause a survivor to stumble, such as a charger hitting a nearby wall, a boomer exploding, standing too close to the explosion of a pipe bomb, propane tank, or oxygen tank, and shooting a nearby surface with a shotgun with explosive ammunition on advanced and expert difficulty. When a survivor is airborne and something triggers them to stumble, they do not play the animation for stumbling. They still, however, take damage from whatever source caused the effect and still stumble in a technical game sense. It's possible to avoid fall damage by interrupting a survivor while falling. This can be done by causing the survivor to stumble. There are a few consistent ways to force a survivor to stumble to avoid fall damage. The easiest and most dependable way is to toss a propane tank to the bottom of a fall, go over the ledge and shoot the propane tank right before hitting the ground, causing it to explode, causing the survivor to stumble. This can be done really reliably with certain weapons, like shotguns. The range as to how close the survivor must be to the explosion is fairly generous. This method can be done on any difficulty setting. Another reliable way is to use explosive ammunition. On Advanced and Expert difficulty, if a survivor shoots a nearby surface with a shotgun with explosive ammunition, it causes them to take damage and stumble. If a survivor goes over a ledge and shoots the floor or a nearby wall right before hitting the ground, they will trigger the stumbling interrupting effect and avoid fall damage. Unfortunately, this method to do this technique is difficult. The timing is really precise, and since players have to be on Advanced or Expert difficulty, the survivor must be at high health, otherwise the self-damage could incapacitate them. There's another way to perform a fall interrupt. This method doesn't involve stumbling. It also does not avoid fall damage entirely, but rather reduces it. The alternative method is to interrupt the fall by starting to revive a teammate. If a survivor falls onto, or close to, an incapacitated survivor and presses to revive them before touching the ground, they take reduced fall damage. The amount of damage reduced with this method isn't a lot, but it can mean the difference between surviving a fall or becoming incapacitated. Here's a rough example of what to expect from this fall damage reduction method. On a second map of Death Toll, falling off this railing to the bottom is a lethal fall, even with full health. Falling from this pipe a little lower incapacitates survivors. Now, if there's a down survivor at the bottom to use for this technique, falling off the railing is survivable, but will incapacitate the survivor, and falling off the pipe now only removes 34 health instead of incapacitating. There's a third way to reduce fall damage, completely different from the other two methods, but it's very limited in use. When a survivor enters an area where the developers wanted to disable fall damage, they're given a temporary status effect that makes it so they can't take fall damage. This effect can persist a little while, even after the survivor exits the invisible trigger area that granted the effect. One area that grants this effect is a slide on the second map of Dark Carnival. If a survivor enters the invisible trigger, and then is quick enough to exit it, run back to the top of the slide and jump off the side, they will take no fall damage as they still have the effect active. Places in Left 4 Dead 2 that disable fall damage are rare. It's not likely the knowledge that the effect can linger will be useful very often. Maybe it'll be useful on some custom maps. The sixth movement technique is called Mounted Gun Boosts, and it's used to fling survivors left or right from a mounted gun. It's possible to fling a survivor away from a mounted gun at a rapid speed. To perform this technique, a player must hold down the jump key and then press to interact with a mounted gun, and then quickly press again to stop interacting with the mounted gun. The speed and distance a survivor is propelled depends on two factors: how fast the player was able to press interact twice, and how far away from the gun the survivor was standing. The faster the player double presses interact, the further the survivor gets flung. It's necessary to press quickly, otherwise the player doesn't get flung. The further away a survivor stands, the further they get flung. Standing as far as possible away from the gun, while still being within range to interact with the gun, will fling the survivor the furthest. There isn't much control as to the direction the survivor is flung. If a survivor is standing to the left of a mounted gun, they will be flung to the right. If a survivor is standing to the right of a mounted gun, they will be flung to the left. Rotating the angle and changing the standing location of the survivor before interacting with the mounted gun can modify the launch direction slightly, but for the most part the only real choices are to get flung left or right. This movement technique is very limited in use. There aren't very many mounted guns in Left 4 Dead 2. Additionally, most mounted guns don't have the necessary clearance to the left or right of them. When used, the survivor simply hits the obstruction on the side. The most useful place on an official map to use this movement technique is probably on the final map of No Mercy. In this instance, it's primarily useful to escape danger, but also could be used for fun and to show off to your teammates. The seventh movement technique is called Infected Boosts, and it's used to climb to unintended ledges and skip portions of maps. Common infected take up space. They're solid to survivors and can be collided with. When a survivor lands on a common infected, the infected dies. For a brief moment before they die, they can be stood on. In this tiny span of time, it's possible to use the infected as a platform and jump off of them. An infected boost is performed by manipulating common infected into standing in a certain location and then using them as a platform. The timing to jump off of an infected is very precise. The time window is very small. It's tricky to manipulate the infected into standing in the right location. It can be done by having the infected chase a survivor, but this method is time consuming and not very reliable. Using a pipe bomb can force a few infected into standing in the correct location, but creates only a small time window to perform this technique, since they'll explode. Using a boomer bile is the most reliable way to manipulate the infected for this technique, as they'll occupy the space until the effect wears off. Important note for this technique: jumping off of infected that are climbing walls can give the survivor a small push upwards. Here are some useful locations to use this technique. On the third map of the parish, the van can be climbed over by standing here, facing this angle, holding strafe left, and jumping on an infected. On the second map of the passing, Survivors can skip a large portion of walking in sewer water by jumping across to the suspended walkway. This one requires using Boomerbile on the railing in the water and then jumping on the infected who stand on the railing. On the fourth map of Death Toll, a portion of the running crescendo event can be skipped by jumping on an electrical utility box and then onto a yellow bollard and then off of some common infected as they attempt to climb up. For this one, be aware that the roof has an overhang. Don't hit your head. The eighth movement technique is called Tank Punch Boosts, and it's used to skip portions of maps. The boss special infected, known as a tank, can punch a survivor so hard that they get sent flying. This can be used to skip portions of maps. To perform this technique, a survivor needs to manipulate the movement of the tank to get them to stand in the correct location. Then, just as the tank begins to punch the survivor needs to jump. The force of the punch propels them through the air. It's best to perform this technique on lower difficulties, as the tank can deal a lot of damage on advanced and always incapacitates on expert. It's useful to understand the way the tank AI works to better manipulate their movement. Tanks focus on one target at a time. When far from their target, they can throw rocks. When close, they only chase down and punch their target. If a breakable wall or heavy physics object is in their path, they will punch it. Tanks can change their target after throwing a rock, if they're hit with a melee weapon, if a survivor gets covered in Boomerbile, if a survivor gets pinned by a special infected, if their target gets incapacitated, if a survivor uses a mounted gun, and if they're close to a survivor reviving an incapacitated survivor. They can also change their target for seemingly no reason at all. Ideally, the tank's target is the survivor attempting this technique. Tanks will still punch survivors they're not focused on if they get too close, but it's way more consistent to get launched in the correct direction if the tank is focused on the survivor doing the technique. The ninth movement technique is called Strafe Jumping, and it's used to control movement while airborne. It's possible to control the way survivors move while in the air. Players can hold forward, backward, strafe left, and strafe right, and these inputs push the survivor in combination with whatever direction they were going before they left the ground. As a consequence of having a little bit of control while airborne, and the way that physics works, survivors can actually curve the trajectory of their jumps. A strafe jump is performed by first running forward and then jumping. By turning the camera left or right and holding down the strafe keys left or right in the same direction, a player can perform a strafe jump. For clarity, to strafe jump left, the player has to hold down left strafe and turn the camera left while in the air. To strafe jump right, the player has to hold down right strafe and turn the camera right while in the air. While airborne, it's possible to alternate directions. This is done by simply switching the strafe key pressed and the camera's turning direction. This is how to perform a strafe jump for practical purposes. There are also less practical ways to perform strafe jumps. This movement technique comes from complementing the momentum the survivor already has before leaving the ground. It can be performed in different, harder to utilize orientations. So, for example, if a survivor is moving right before leaving the ground, instead of holding strafe left and moving the camera left, the player can hold forward and move the camera left. This will cause the survivor to jump in a curve left. Here's an overhead shot to visualize the trajectory of a normal strafe jump. One way to think about it is, the survivor would normally move forward, but the sideways push force, coupled with turning the camera, pushes them around a focal point. They end up going in a circle around the focal point. This movement technique has a lot of uses. It can be used to travel faster by taking more direct paths through maps. Essentially, it can be used to cut corners and traverse terrain more efficiently. For example, at the end of the fourth map of Death Toll, survivors must jump down before the safe room and proceed right. Instead of falling down and then going right, a survivor can strafe jump right off the ledge and land closer to the door. A survivor doing this could potentially skip a small, but significant portion of the Endless Horde event. Another use for this movement technique is to help guide a jump in a dangerous situation. For example, on the first map of Dead Center, a survivor can avoid plummeting to their death by strafe jumping to the adjacent ledge. You know, it's actually kind of fun. You could jump off a ledge and strafe jump right back onto the ledge you just jumped off of. Impress your friends by not plummeting to your death. That's what I call a party trick. This movement technique plays a major role in bunny hopping. Speaking of, the 10th movement technique is called bunny hopping, and it's used to traverse the play space faster than intended, preserve momentum, and avoid slowdown effects. To perform a bunny hop, a survivor must jump as soon as they hit the ground. Doing so correctly allows the survivor to maintain momentum. When combined with strafe jumping, bunny hopping can allow a survivor to travel faster than running. To perform this movement technique, the player must time their jumps very precisely. It's common for someone unfamiliar with bunny hopping to assume they're performing the technique correctly, when in actuality, they're just jumping over and over. Incorrectly performed bunny hops are detrimental as they can actually cause a player to travel slower than just running. One way to practice bunny hops is in the starting safe room on the 4th map of Dark Carnival. Jumping from the ground onto the queue-lined fences and then off of them should be fluid. Survivors should preserve momentum and jump right off of them. If a survivor stops on top of the fence, the jump timing was incorrect. To give more insight as to how precise this movement technique is, the game runs at 30 ticks per second. In other words, the game updates the game state and registers player inputs 30 times in 1 second. Because there are 1000 milliseconds in a second, the window of time to perform a bunny hop is 33 milliseconds. Assuming a player is playing the game at 60 frames per second, that's a 2-frame window of time. Like I said, this movement technique is very precise. In other Source Engine games, players use scripts or bind spinning their mouse wheel to perform jump inputs. Using the mouse wheel ensures the jump input can be spammed rapidly. Unfortunately, these techniques don't work in Left 4 Dead 2. The benefits of this movement technique are partly dependent on the terrain. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to retain speed when bunny hopping on an uphill slope. It is not recommended to bunny hop up a slope. On a flat, leveled surface, bunny hopping can be done fairly consistently. If the surface is bumpy and uneven, the difficulty increases. As an example, the long stretch of river the survivors travel over on the final map of Cold Stream is thoroughly uneven and therefore difficult to bunny hop on. It's very beneficial to bunny hop down a slope. The reason is, it's easy to gain a large amount of speed, and knowing how to airstrafe isn't necessary. Players who have not mastered the timing for bunny hopping, or the movement of airstrafing, should still attempt to bunny hop on downward slopes, as the benefits are great, and the downside of failing and stalling isn't too bad. Bunny hopping can be used to negate the slowdown effect of various locations. For example, the water on the ground in the campaign Hard Rain. If a survivor first travels at a faster speed, jumps as they enter the slowdown area, and successfully bunny hops, they can retain the speed they entered the area with. Note, it's more difficult to bunny hop in muddy water. It's harder to time jumps since the ground can't be seen. The 11th movement technique is called Crouch Jumping, and it's used to augment bunny hopping. Crouch jumps are performed by holding down the crouch key after pressing jump. They're quite simple to execute. There are a few misconceptions about this movement technique. Unlike other Source Engine games, crouch jumping in Left 4 Dead 2 does not allow survivors to climb onto higher platforms than normal jumps. Another difference is survivors don't have reduced air resistance. If a survivor gets flung through the air in any way, they slow down at the same speed, they travel the same distance, regardless of if the player is crouching while airborne. The main purpose of this movement technique is to improve bunny hopping. By crouch jumping while bunny hopping, survivors can build speed faster and travel faster. The downside of this technique is it's extremely difficult to do well, and even more difficult to do well consistently. For crouching bunny hops, the crouch key is continuously held down the entire time after the initial jump. Quick note, the reason why it's faster to crouch jump while bunny hopping is because the survivor is airborne for slightly longer. Being airborne longer means they benefit more from the velocity generated by strafe jumping. Crouch jump bunny hopping is probably the most difficult movement technique in the game. It's not recommended for novices. On the other hand, there's no better way to learn something than to try it and practice. A lot of the movement techniques found in this video can be tricky. I've included a few console commands in the video's description to make it easy for anyone to load up a map and give them all a try. Check it out when you're done watching this video. Speaking of, this is the end of the video. It turns out the movement mechanics of Left 4 Dead 2 aren't as simple as they seem. There's a lot of depth and nuance, mostly due to bugs and unintended side effects of the game engine. I hope the information found here in this video will be useful for many people. It's been a pleasure researching and documenting it all. Thanks for watching! Au revoir!